The night my father announced he was selling the family business for $38 million, my brothers were so busy celebrating that neither of them noticed the look on my face. They thought I was stunned, because I was losing my job. My father thought I was hurt because he had decided neither of his sons, or his daughter, would inherit Carter Industrial Supply. What none of them knew was that I had already spent nearly 2 years preparing for that exact moment. And when my father finally told us who was buying the company, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Because the buyer wasn't some distant investment firm. It was mine. My name is Lauren Carter, and for most of my adult life, I worked for my father's company while quietly learning everything he never thought I was capable of understanding. Carter Industrial Supply was started by my grandfather in 1989 out of a rented warehouse outside Cincinnati, Ohio. By the time I joined the company, it had grown into a regional industrial supplier with warehouses across 3 states, hundreds of commercial customers, and a payroll large enough that one bad decision could cost the company millions. My father, Richard Carter, had taken over after my grandfather retired. He was 62 when this story happened, and he was the kind of man who believed leadership looked like standing at the front of a room while other people did the work. He was good at selling. He was good at shaking hands. He was good at walking into a meeting, remembering everyone's name, telling a funny story, and making people feel like they had known him for 20 years. What he wasn't good at was noticing the person sitting 3 offices away who had spent the entire night fixing the mistake that would have cost him a contract. That person was usually me. I started working at Carter Industrial Supply when I was 23. At first, I was supposed to be temporary. 6 months, maybe. My degree was in business administration, and I had planned to move to Chicago after graduation. Dad convinced me to stay. Just help me get the books cleaned up, he said. 6 months. I agreed. 6 months turned into 6 years. Then 12. Then 17. I eventually handled accounting, payroll, insurance renewals, vendor negotiations, contract reviews, compliance paperwork, and a ridiculous number of things that weren't technically my job but somehow became my problem whenever something went wrong. If a major customer wanted different payment terms, I handled it. If a vendor threatened to increase prices, I negotiated. If an insurance renewal came back with a huge premium increase, I found another carrier. If payroll software crashed at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, I was the person everyone called. And if everything worked perfectly, nobody noticed. That last part took me years to understand. My father didn't think I was incompetent. That would have been easier. He simply didn't see me as someone who could lead. There was a difference. My brothers were Jason and Matthew. Jason was 3 years older than me. Matthew was 2 years younger. Dad treated both of them like future executives from the time they were teenagers. Jason could walk into the office at 22 wearing jeans and a polo shirt, spend half the afternoon talking about sports, and Dad would introduce him to clients as the next generation. Matthew was more impulsive. He changed departments every few years. Sales, operations, purchasing, marketing. Dad called it cross-training. If I suggested moving departments, Dad would say, "But you're so good at the numbers." I eventually understood what that meant. Stay in the background. Be useful. Don't expect the spotlight. I didn't complain. At least, not for a long time. Because there was another reason I stayed. I loved the company. I loved walking through the warehouse and hearing forklifts moving pallets around. I loved seeing orders go from a spreadsheet to trucks heading down the highway. I loved the feeling of solving a problem nobody else could figure out. And, if I'm being honest, I loved my father. That was the complicated part. People assume that when you're treated unfairly by your parents, you must hate them. I didn't. I wanted his approval so badly that sometimes I mistook disappointment for motivation. Whenever Dad said, "Jason has a real instinct for business," I would work harder. Whenever he said, "Matthew has confidence," I'd tell myself I needed to be more confident. Whenever he introduced me as the person who keeps us organized, I'd smile. I convinced myself that eventually he'd see me. Eventually, he'd realize what I had built. Eventually, he'd understand that the quiet person in the room wasn't necessarily the least powerful. Then, about 2 years before the birthday dinner, something changed. I left the office late one night after negotiating a contract that had been stuck for 3 months. I was sitting in my car, staring through the windshield at the empty parking lot, when I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent 17 years helping my father build a company, but I had never built anything that belonged to me. That thought wouldn't leave, so I started. Quietly, I reached out to 2 former colleagues I trusted. One had worked in operations. The other had spent years in corporate finance. We started small. Very small. We created an investment firm called Northbridge Capital Partners. We didn't have some giant office. We rented a modest suite with 2 conference rooms and a receptionist who worked 3 days a week. Our strategy was simple. Find struggling companies with good underlying businesses. Buy them at the right price. Fix the operations. Improve the financial structure. Then grow them. Our first acquisition was a regional packaging company that had great customers but terrible inventory management. My experience at Carter Industrial Supply made me very good at identifying where businesses were quietly bleeding money. Within a year, the company was profitable again. Then we acquired another, then another. Northbridge grew. I never told Dad. Not because I wanted revenge. At least, that wasn't how I thought about it. I wanted to know whether I could build something without his name attached to it. And maybe, somewhere deep down, I wanted to know whether the problem had ever really been me. If I succeeded without him, I'd have my answer. If I failed, I'd have an answer too. By the time my father turned 62, Northbridge had become something none of my family knew existed. And then Dad announced his birthday dinner. He booked a private room at an upscale restaurant downtown. The kind of place where the steaks were expensive enough that the waiter described the cuts like he was giving a college lecture. There were 8 of us at the table. Dad, Mom, Jason, Matthew, their wives, me, and Dad's longtime business attorney, who had apparently been invited as a special guest. That should have been my first clue, but I didn't know why he was there. Dad was in a great mood. He ordered a bottle of wine for the table, even though he normally complained about restaurant prices. He told stories. He laughed loudly. Jason kept asking what Dad was going to announce. Dad just smiled. Wait until dessert. I remember looking at him across the table. There was something different about him that night. Not nervous. Pleased. Like a man who had been holding on to a secret and couldn't wait to reveal it. Dinner went on for another 40 minutes. Then, dessert arrived. Dad stood. Everyone quieted. He lifted his glass. I've spent 34 years building Carter Industrial Supply. Jason smiled. Matthew straightened in his chair. I watched Dad, carefully. And after 34 years, he said, I've decided it's time to sell Carter Industrial Supply. For a second, nobody reacted. Then everyone started talking at once. Jason actually stood up. You're serious? Dad laughed. Very. Matthew slapped the table. Dad, that's huge. His wife hugged him. Mom looked proud. The attorney simply smiled. I sat still. Dad looked around the table. We've received an offer. Jason asked, from who? Dad raised his glass again. Northbridge Capital. My stomach tightened. Not because I was surprised, because I already knew. I'd known for weeks. I'd sat in meetings about the acquisition. I'd reviewed financial models. I'd negotiated the structure. I'd helped determine the valuation. I'd personally reviewed the operational due diligence. But nobody at that table knew that. Dad continued. They're paying $38 million. The room erupted again. Jason nearly knocked over his glass. 38 million? Matthew laughed. We're rich. Dad smiled. I watched him. Then he looked directly at me. And I want to make something clear. The room got quieter. The new owners are going to bring in their own management structure. I knew exactly where this was going. Dad leaned back. They're not keeping everyone. Jason glanced at me. Matthew did too. Dad continued. Lauren has done good work for the company, but she needs to understand that after the sale, she isn't getting any special position. I stared at him. He said it so casually, as if he were discussing someone's parking space. No executive role, he added. No special arrangement. And obviously she isn't getting the company. Jason laughed. Dad, I don't think Lauren thought she was getting the company. Matthew smirked. Didn't she? Jason looked at me. You always acted like you were running the place. I did run parts of it. He laughed. Sure. Dad smiled. This is exactly why I wanted everyone here tonight. No misunderstandings. I picked up my water. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me. Years ago, that comment would have destroyed me. Tonight, it barely registered. Because there was something my father didn't understand. He thought he was telling me I had no future. He didn't know I'd already built one. I took a sip. Dad? He looked at me. Yes? I set the glass down. Who exactly is the buyer? He smiled. Northbridge Capital Partners. Jason leaned back. Some private equity group. That's right. I nodded. And they're paying $38 million? Yes. Have you read the entire purchase agreement? Dad frowned slightly. My attorneys have reviewed it for months. I know. He looked confused. What does that mean? I glanced at the attorney sitting beside him. The attorney suddenly looked uncomfortable. I folded my hands on the table. I just wanted to make sure you understood exactly who you're selling to. Dad laughed. Lauren, I think I understand the deal. I hope so. Jason rolled his eyes. Here we go. Matthew laughed. She's going to lecture Dad about the sale. I ignored them. Dad leaned toward me. You've been in the accounting department too long. That old sentence. The one he had used for years. I smiled. No. I looked directly at him. I've been in the business long enough. The attorney shifted in his seat. Dad noticed. What's wrong? The attorney looked at me, then at Richard, then back at me. I could see the moment he realized I wasn't asking questions. I already knew the answers. Dad's smile faded. Lauren. Yes? Why are you asking me these questions? I reached into my purse. I took out my phone. For a moment, I simply held it in my hand. I wasn't going to reveal everything. Not yet. I wanted my father to understand what was happening before I said the words. Because for 17 years he had believed I was the daughter who handled the paperwork. The daughter who stayed in the background. The daughter who couldn't possibly understand the big decisions. He had spent years looking past me. And now, sitting at that dinner table, I finally had the strange privilege of watching him look directly at me, without knowing what he was seeing. I turned my phone screen toward him. There was an email open. The sender was Northbridge Capital Partners. The subject line read, Carter Industrial Supply Acquisition. Final approval. Dad read it. Then he looked at me. Why do you have that? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at the attorney. Did Richard tell you who signed the final approval? The attorney's face went pale. Dad's expression changed. Lauren, what are you talking about? I finally leaned back in my chair. And for the first time that night, I let myself smile. Because there was one name on that agreement my father had apparently never bothered to ask about. Mine. Nobody at the table spoke. The restaurant around us kept moving. Glasses clinked, waiters crossed the room, someone at another table laughed. But inside our private dining room, it felt like the air had been vacuumed out. Dad looked from my phone to me, then back to the attorney. What does she mean? Our attorney, David Collins, had represented Carter Industrial Supply for almost 20 years. I had watched him negotiate contracts with suppliers, settle disputes, and talk my father out of more bad ideas than anyone knew. I'd never seen him lose his composure. Until then. He loosened his tie. Richard, no. Dad's voice hardened. Answer the question. David looked at me first, almost asking permission. I gave the smallest nod. He exhaled. The final approval for the acquisition was signed by Lauren Carter in her capacity as Managing Director of Northbridge Capital Partners. Silence. Jason laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was impossible. Okay, he said. Seriously. What is this? Matthew shook his head. Lauren works in accounting. I looked at him. I used to. Dad slowly lowered the phone onto the table. You're telling me... He couldn't even finish the sentence. I founded Northbridge, I said quietly. No. With 2 partners. No. For the last 22 months. Jason looked at Dad. Tell me she's joking. Nobody answered him. I reached into my purse again and slid a leather business card holder across the table. Dad opened it. Inside was a navy blue business card. Lauren Carter, Managing Director, Northbridge Capital Partners. He stared at it for a long time. I've never seen this. I know. You've been hiding this? I've been building it. Matthew leaned forward. Hold on. Northbridge is buying Carter Industrial? Yes. You're the investment group? Yes. No, you're not. I smiled sadly. I understand why that sounds impossible. Jason pushed back from the table. This is insane. It probably feels that way. You've been working for Dad this whole time? Yes. And secretly building a company that's buying his? Yes. He looked at David. You knew? David nodded once. I was under a confidentiality agreement. Dad looked betrayed. You represented me. I did. And you represented her? I represented the transaction. Dad sank back into his chair. For the first time in my life, I watched my father become the quietest person in the room. The hardest part wasn't telling them. It was explaining why. Dad finally looked up. When? When what? When did this start? 2 years ago. While you were still working for me? Yes. Every day? Most days. Matthew frowned. How? I laughed softly. That question is exactly why I never told any of you. Jason crossed his arms. Then answer it. So I did. It started with one client. 17 years inside Carter Industrial had taught me something my father never realized. He saw companies as products and warehouses. I saw systems. I knew where businesses quietly lost money. I knew how poor inventory controls destroyed cash flow. I knew how bad purchasing contracts could erase profits without anyone noticing. Most importantly, I knew how to fix those problems. A former operations director I'd worked with years earlier called me one night about a struggling packaging company in Kentucky. It has great customers, he told me. Terrible management. I spent a weekend reviewing their financials. By Monday morning, I knew exactly why they were failing. They weren't losing customers. They were losing control of inventory. I built a turnaround plan. The owner loved it. That became our first investment. Northbridge wasn't born with millions of dollars. It started with 3 people investing nearly everything they had, convincing lenders to believe in us, and working 80-hour weeks because failure wasn't an option. The first year, I barely slept. I'd spend 8 hours at Carter Industrial. Then I'd drive across town to Northbridge's office and work until midnight. Weekends disappeared. Vacations disappeared. Dating disappeared. I wasn't living 2 lives because it was exciting. I was doing it because I wanted to know whether I could build something without anyone handing it to me. Dad listened without interrupting. That alone felt unusual. Mom finally spoke. You never told us. No. Why? I looked at her. Would you have believed me? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Jason answered instead. I would have. I raised an eyebrow. You introduced me as the accounting girl at your charity golf tournament. His face flushed. That was a joke. It wasn't. He looked away. I continued. Dad introduced you as the future of Carter Industrial. I looked at Matthew. He called you an executive before you'd managed a single department. Then I looked back at my father. You introduced me as the person who kept everyone organized. Dad swallowed. I was proud of you. I know you were. No, you don't. I do. I leaned forward. You were proud of me, the way people are proud of electricity. He frowned. You only noticed me when something stopped working. That landed. I could see it, because it was true. Dessert had gone untouched. The candles on Dad's birthday cake had burned themselves out. A waiter quietly entered, saw our faces, and immediately backed out again. Matthew broke the silence. So, the 38 million is real? Yes. You actually raised that kind of money? We did. How? By proving we could create value. Jason laughed bitterly. You're telling me you built a private equity firm while doing payroll? I built it because I understood payroll. He frowned. What does that mean? It means businesses don't fail because CEOs give bad speeches. I looked around the table. They fail because invoices don't get collected. Contracts aren't negotiated. Insurance gets renewed late. Inventory sits too long. Payroll gets mismanaged. I smiled faintly. All the boring things. Dad looked at me differently then. Not proudly. Not yet. Curiously. Like he was seeing someone he'd somehow never met. Why buy my company? He asked. The room went quiet again. That was the real question. I answered honestly. Because it's a good business. He looked hurt. That's all? No. I paused. I also couldn't stand watching it slowly become vulnerable. Jason frowned. What are you talking about? I looked at Dad. You've been delaying warehouse modernization for 6 years. He blinked. You knew about that? I prepared the cost analysis. You said it was expensive. I said delaying it would become more expensive. I continued. Your margins have been shrinking because purchasing contracts haven't been updated. Customer retention is strong, but operational efficiency has stalled. Dad stared at me. You've been analyzing my company. I've been analyzing our company for 17 years. He rubbed his forehead. So this wasn't revenge. No. You're not trying to destroy Carter Industrial? I almost laughed. Dad, why would I spend $38 million to destroy the company I've spent my adult life protecting? He looked embarrassed. I don't know. Exactly. Northbridge wasn't buying Carter Industrial because I wanted my father to lose. We were buying it because it was worth saving before someone else stripped it apart for parts. There was a huge difference. Jason leaned back. So, what happens now? I looked at him. That depends. On what? Whether you're actually good at your job. He frowned. What? I don't believe in inherited titles. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I continued. Every leadership position will be evaluated. Matthew shifted. So we're interviewing for our own jobs? Yes. With you? With the executive team. Dad looked at me. You'd really do that? I have to. You're my daughter. And you taught me that business decisions shouldn't be emotional. His eyes closed briefly. I wasn't trying to punish him. I was simply applying the standard he'd claimed to believe in. Dinner ended awkwardly. Nobody wanted coffee. Nobody wanted cake. As people gathered their coats, Dad stopped me near the doorway. Walk with me. We stepped outside into the cool evening. Downtown Cincinnati glowed across the river. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then Dad said quietly, I'm trying to figure out whether I should be angry or proud. I smiled. You don't have to choose tonight. He looked at me. Did you really think I'd never respect you? I took longer answering that than anything else he'd asked. I thought you respected what I did. He nodded. But not what I could become. His shoulders sagged. I think you're right. That hurt him to say. I could hear it. He leaned against the railing. When you were little, he laughed softly. You used to follow me around the warehouse. I remember. You'd ask 1,000 questions. You answered every one. I stopped. Yes. He looked out at the city. I don't know when. I do. He turned. When? When Jason got old enough to stand beside you. He didn't argue. The acquisition closed 6 weeks later. There were regulators, lenders, auditors, and enough paperwork to fill an entire conference room. When the closing documents were signed, Carter Industrial officially became part of Northbridge Capital Partners. Dad retired exactly as he'd planned. The only difference was that the outside investors he'd been bragging about at his birthday dinner turned out to include the daughter he'd spent years overlooking. People always ask what happened to my brothers. The answer surprises them. I didn't fire either of them. Jason stayed. He was actually an excellent salesperson once he stopped assuming leadership was automatic. Matthew surprised everyone. Away from the expectation that he'd inherit authority, he became one of our strongest operations managers. Both of them had to earn their roles. So did everyone else. including me. I was probably held to the highest standard of all. That's exactly how I wanted it. Dad came back to the office 3 months after retirement. Not to interfere. Just to visit. He walked through the warehouse slowly. New equipment had already been installed. Digital inventory systems were replacing paper logs. Shipping times had improved. Employees stopped him constantly to say hello. When he reached my office, he knocked. "Do I need an appointment?" I laughed. "Never." He looked around. My office wasn't flashy. Just organized. A framed photo of our grandfather's original warehouse hung on the wall. Dad noticed it. "You kept that?" "Of course." He nodded. "I always thought legacy meant leaving something to your sons." I stayed quiet. He smiled sadly. "I think I misunderstood legacy." The biggest conversation happened 6 months later. Dad invited me to breakfast at the same diner where he'd taken me before my first day at Carter Industrial. He stirred his coffee for a long time before speaking. "I owe you an apology. You don't owe me one because you sold the company." He looked up. "I know. You owe me one because you spent years making me believe I was valuable only when I was useful." His eyes filled. "Yes. I believe that." "I know. And I almost believed it about myself." He reached across the table. "I'll regret that for the rest of my life." I believed him. Not because the words were perfect. Because they were honest. People think this story is about $38 million. It isn't. It's about what happens when someone spends years confusing quiet competence with a lack of ambition. My father didn't lose his company. He sold it exactly the way he wanted. What he almost lost was something much harder to rebuild. His relationship with the daughter who had been standing beside him all along. For years, everyone in my family thought I was the woman behind the spreadsheets. The woman who handled payroll. The woman who kept the lights on while other people made the big decisions. They weren't entirely wrong. I did keep the lights on. I just happened to be building the power company at the same time. And sometimes the people who are underestimated the longest aren't waiting for permission to lead. They're quietly becoming the ones everyone else will eventually have to follow.